Hello, welcome to another edition of the Father Tim Talks. The presentation today is called Reconciliation. It's More Than Confession. The reason I titled that is when we see or hear the word reconciliation, we often think of, the sacrament of confession or penance. But I'd like to look a little bit more and expand that definition and understanding of reconciliation to see that it takes place and it's needed in many more areas of life. An overview of why I'm doing this is we see increased polarization in our world, countries kind of at war with one another, and also reconciliation is part of the precious blood spirituality. And given that our cluster parishes are staffed and ministered to by the missionaries of the precious blood, I think it's important that we share a little of our spirituality so that you can incorporate that in your own lives. And lastly, there is clearly a need in our world and in our lives for reconciliation. We experience brokenness in our lives that cries out for reconciliation. In our writings and reflections on the precious blood spirituality, we often talk about the cry of the blood. That hurts and life cry out for reconciliation. When we're hurting, we seek, somehow to have the relationship restored so that we don't feel that pent up anger and that eats away at us. And we see lives that are taken unjustly, blood being shed in our streets, cry out for some sense of justice and reconciliation. Broken relationships are part of the history of humankind since the beginning. And it's symbolized and talked about in Genesis, where we see, the first humans, Adam and Eve, that relationship that they had with God that was really good was severed through their disobedience. God told them not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They did, and thus that relationship that they had with God was altered and was hurt. A little bit later in Genesis, we have the story of Cain and Abel, where they both are offering a sacrifice, and God accepts Abel's sacrifice and not Cain's. And so Cain then attacks and murders his brother. Here's an artist's conception of the murder of Abel. Here's another picture of that. We see Abel's blood on the ground there, and from Genesis 4:10b, it says, "Listen, your brother's blood cries out from the ground." That blood cries out for restoration, for healing, and reparation. Reconciliation, then, is a fundamental response to broken relationships that we have on personal and social levels, to the hurts caused by the choices we make, sometimes consciously, other times unconsciously, where we, just by mistake. But that doesn't take away from the hurt that it caused another person. To divisions among people, families, races, religions. We see, sometimes families, where there's division among families. And the last few years here in our country, we look at, the race relations that have been hurt by different people of different races. And we see even conflicts among different religions. And obviously international conflicts. They've been with us seemingly, one gets taken care of and then there's another one. So these go on and on. Reconciliation then is, in the words of the former Moderator General, Father Barry Fisher, that's the superior of the Precious Blood community throughout the world, Father Barry says that reconciliation is bringing people and things into their proper relationship. Reconciliation comes from the Latin word reconciliare. Re means again, and conciliare means to bring together. So again, reconciliation literally means to bring together again. What was together was separated somehow through some hurt, and the reconciliation is about bringing that together again. It can also be looked at as kind of bridging the gap. You see in the background of this slide, I've got kind of two stones here that are kind of separated. What reconciliation can kind of do then is to be that bridge that brings those together again. Father Bob Schreider, a Precious Blood missionary, confrere of mine, wrote a book a number of years ago called The Ministry of Reconciliation. And these next couple ideas are taken directly from his book. Schreiner says that there's a couple of themes that are necessary we got to kind of look at in reconciliation. First one is dignity and identity. Looking at the dignity and identity of a person is a return to wholeness, that the hurt doesn't have the same power over us. When we get hurt, sometimes really bad, it just kind of takes over and we feel less than whole, less than human sometimes because of this hole that's in our heart. That's H-O-L-E, not W-H-O-L-E. Reconciliation then is about recovering an identity of and worth. That we're realizing that that each human was created in the image of God and have that dignity, and so some of that was taken away through the hurt that was caused. So reconciliation is about restoring that identity and worth. And then in communities, it's about restoring relationships between people and realizing the common traits that we share sometimes as human beings. Reconciliation is about memory and truth. Sometimes memories get distorted when we're hurt, and they masquerade as the truth. What we've got to do is get to the truth of what actually happened, realizing, the past can't be ignored. You can't forget about that because the individual who was hurt, that's something that's very real to them. It can't be ignored. Truth lies then at the heart of reconciliation. And the lies have to be confronted on both parts. Sometimes, those distorted memories can be lies on the part of the victim, but we have to get to the truth in order for there to be authentic reconciliation. For Christians, for Catholics, resurrection tends to be the key for reconciliation. What we look at that is we can imagine Jesus on the cross and, the anguish that he felt. But he goes on the cross and takes his death, something good is going to come from this. He goes with complete trust in his God, knowing that something good will come. And he was resurrected, and his body was transformed. But that body still bore the wounds of his crucifixion. They weren't wiped away. So that original harmony then between God and humans was restored. The disobedience of Adam and Eve was restored by the obedience of Jesus. When Jesus says, "Not my will, but yours be done," that harmony again was restored for all human beings. This is an interesting painting of the resurrection. Obviously, no one witnessed the resurrection, and various artists have taken, interpretations of it. I like this one. It was by Tintoretto in about the 15th century. And you see, Jesus kind of looks a little worn out. Good reason. And if we zoom in on that, we can see that the wound is still there in his hand and in his side. And then you look at his face, it looks kind of sunken in. He looks like he's been through the mill and back. And he was. So he is alive. Those wounds that were part of his death are still there, but he is transformed. Reconciliation takes place on many different levels. We know personally, trying to restore relationships with God and or with individuals. Relationship with God, when we break that, when that gets hurt, we seek reconciliation through the sacrament of penance or the rite of reconciliation. With individuals, they have to have dialogue in order to restore that relationship. Reconciliation also can kind of take place and is needed sometimes in communities. And I'm using this as in a kind of a smaller group of people than as kind of a society. We look at, reconciliation can be needed to restore relationship with people like in church communities. Sometimes there's something maybe have happened in a parish, or there's two different kinds of sides to what the parish should be. There needs to be reconciliation there, restoring relationships between people in this community. It can also, as we've seen in recent years, a need for reconciliation in society, restoring relationships among peoples, races, and communities. In the last few years, we've seen a lot of the racial tensions in this country that, even though we think have been, taken care of, they obviously are not. And then finally, one that's not, this is just a recent idea, kind of a reconciliation with the environment. Pope Francis, in a recent encyclical, Laudato Si, talks about restoring the relationship with the earth. You know, for so many years, we would just take and take and take and dump and dump and dump on the earth, and we can't realize we can't do that anymore. We've got to seek a different kind of relationship with the earth. How do we do that? There's some questions. You'll see there's more questions than answers. First, we need to look at what needs to be reconciled. That can be on a personal level or in a larger societal level. Because victims and wrongdoers have different perspectives, obviously. For the wrongdoers, they sometimes can say, I don't know what you're getting all upset about. I didn't do anything wrong. Victims, they can point to specific acts or things that need to be addressed. And then at the societal level, we see the bystanders who really have no intimate part in this. Let's get this over as soon as we can so things can get back to normal. We're trying to find the root causes of what caused the problems, particularly like in a societal reconciliation. More questions. What's the best way to bring this about? We know the cliche, time heals all wounds, and there's a certain truth to that, that with the passage of time, the hurts are less raw, and we're able to kind of deal with those a little bit better. And we also kind of need to take a look at cultural issues. Back in the early mid-1990s in Africa, the country of Rwanda, there was warring tribes there, the Tutsis and the Hutus. And there was murders galore. And as a result of that, there were a lot of children that lost their parents that were murdered by the other tribe. So there were some folks that went in there trying to help the children deal with this. And, kids aren't real good at expressing their feelings. And so what they decided to do is say, well, let's get them to draw pictures. And that may help them express their feelings. So they gave them crayons, nice colorful crayons here. But the Rwandan children had never seen crayons before. And so rather than draw with them, they decided to eat them. Again, not what the folks that were trying to help them had in mind, but you can see, being a little more sensitive to the culture, what they were in, and trying to help the best way to bring reconciliation about. And then particularly like in a society, we need to look at what the final outcome or state will be like. Obviously, the survivors should have some say in bringing the truth to light, and we try to come up with ways to prevent these events from happening again, and then attempt to reincorporate the victims and survivors together as a people. On a personal level, relationships are different after reconciliation. They may be weaker or they can be stronger. We just don't know. It depends on there, but the relationship will be different. For example, we look at Peter's denial of Jesus 3 times, and then Peter reconciled with Jesus, and Jesus then gave him the keys to the kingdom. So the relationship was different. And we look at kind of a personal example here, if you think back to your days as a teen or perhaps your teenage children, if they were late for curfew. Probably you heard or said, it's going to take a while before, I can trust you again. And so trying to set up conditions so that this won't happen again. Most often then the wayward teen is grounded so that it won't happen and trust can begin to be built up again. On a social level, we're trying to look at some way to bring some sense of justice or making right, balancing the crime with the punishment, is that the punishment of the wrongdoers attempts to bring forth some sense of justice or balance, where the state seeks to balance the harm that was done to the individual with an appropriate punishment, or the harm that was done to the state with a particular punishment. And then looking ahead, they try to change the legal or social order to try to prevent these events from happening again. Forgiveness. Psychologist Dr. James Walsh came up with a definition about forgiveness. He says, forgiveness is when people, upon rationally determining that they have been wronged, willfully abandon resentment and related response. So rather than trying to reach out to try to cause harm to the other, what forgiveness is the one who is wronged gives up on this. They rationally determine that they're not going to try to get resentment or revenge on the person or any other kind of response. They want a different outcome for this. Forgiveness. As I mentioned before, we can't forgive and forget. That hurt sometimes are there, and I think that's unrealistic, and it doesn't do really justice to the individual saying, oh, that wasn't that bad, just forget about it. They can't do that. Reconciliation, that is both a process and a decision. So like forgiveness, you're deciding not to let that hurt have the same power over and eat away in us. And reconciliation, that is a process. The process of becoming free from the past. We acknowledge the wounds and the memory, but those don't have the same hold over us as they did before. And it's a decision for a different future. It's a change of the victim's relationship to the deed's ongoing effect to the survivor's rejection of the fate of the traumatic event. We make a decision that we're not going to be a victim anymore, where that hurt defines us, but we're going to be a survivor that has overcome that. Now, this is difficult for sure, and especially when the wrongdoer doesn't acknowledge guilt. But the decision on the hurt individual's part, you can't let that hurt consume you. It just eats away at you, and it sometimes can cripple. Again, we're looking at the no longer a victim of this particular act, but a survivor, that the hurt doesn't have the same power. And I think this can happen even if there is no admission of guilt on the other, because this is a decision that the harmed individual makes. They're not going to let the hurt define them anymore. So it's about repentance and forgiveness. There's some sort of repentance from the wrongdoing. We often think of an apology, and again, it's getting at the truth of what happened, where the individual who brought about harm takes responsibility for that and has a change of heart and new direction. This can happen, and that's obviously the outcome that we hope will happen. And then the victim forgives, or the victim often, that kind of reverse, the victim forgives first. Again, that's a decision that they make. On a societal level, we're looking at the goal as a reconstruction of a more just or safe society. This begins with the wrongdoer. Now, for example, some of you may remember reading or studying in history about apartheid, which was the legalized separation of blacks and whites in South Africa. Well, in the 1990s, that came about, that was outlawed. And we look again here in the USA. We've got some hurts that were caused by people that have yet to been, brought about an authentic reconstruction of a safer or more just society. Often a societal reconciliation, it begins with the wrongdoer, a public repentance, and then those relationships can be restored in reconciliation. It's rather, on a personal level, it begins with an individual. In a societal one, it often begins with the offenders who brought this about. In South Africa, they had, after apartheid, they set up what was called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And what they did is they wanted to get at the truth of what happened so they could reform their society so that these things would not happen again. So they called in people who had committed crimes, whites against blacks, and there's over 3,000 pages of testimony. And what they did, because they really wanted to get at the truth, is they said that anyone who testified before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, they would get amnesty. They would not be punished for their crimes. And most of them were not, because they felt that the truth was so important to come out that they were willing to take that risk to give amnesty to some individuals. On a personal level, It's about restoration of a damaged humanity. You know, when we're hurt, we feel damaged, and it just, again, kind of eats away at us. At a personal level, as I mentioned before, it usually begins with the victim who says, I'm not going to let this define me anymore. So that it begins with that, the process begins with the individual who then forgives. And again, that doesn't mean that, you know, everything is hunky-dory, but forgiveness is not choosing to follow the logical path of resentment against the other. And then hopefully what happens is that there's some form of repentance on the part of the wrongdoer. Cardinal Bernardine, who was Archbishop here in the Archdiocese of Cincinnati in the early 80s, wrote a book called The Gift of Peace. And this was finished up right about 2 weeks before he died, and when he was cardinal in Chicago. And it's a very short book, and I would just highly encourage you to see if you can get a copy of it on Amazon or something like that. And in this book, Bernardine talks about reconciliation that he had in his own life. Joseph Bernardine had been accused, when he was Cardinal of Chicago, of sexual abuse. He came out, he said he's going to tell the truth. He says, I did not do this. I don't know where it's coming. And again, he kind of said to some of his advisors that he notes in the book, he says that some good will come from this. Right? So the victim, or the accuser, then recanted his story and said, you know, this didn't happen. It was a mistaken memory. And so Bernardine didn't hold any harm against him. He wanted to seek reconciliation, the one that was hurt by these false accusations. So what Bernardine did is he went out and he sought a meeting with this individual who had accused him falsely and sought reconciliation. So it began with the victim. These were a couple of cases. Again, they're getting a little older, but I think the impact is still there. The young man on the right, Matthew Shepard, was killed on October 12, 1998. He was out in the wilds of Wyoming. McKinney was gay, and he was brutally murdered, and his body left to hang on a fence post out in some cattle field in the middle of Wyoming. The young man who killed him and was convicted of killing him, Aaron McKinney, is on the left there. And he was found guilty and tried. And then at the sentencing phase, Matthew Shepard's parents gave some statement, and this was in November of 1999. And this is a powerful statement from Matthew Shepard's dad. He says, I too believe in the death penalty. I would like nothing better than to see you die, Mr. McKinney. However, this is the time to begin the healing process. Mr. McKinney there, or Mr. Shepard, saw that, you know, nothing would bring his son back, and he wanted to begin the healing process. That's quite a statement there. And yet, in another way, back in October of 2006, some of you may remember that a man went in and shot a number of Amish children in their school in Nickel Mines, Pennsylvania. It's interesting among the Amish that words of forgiveness were sent to the killer's family before the blood had dried on the schoolhouse floor. And again, you know, seeking forgiving. They didn't want this. They had lost their children. They didn't want that hurt to kind of keep eating away inside of them. We see some pictures here down at the bottom. You can see the schoolhouse where the children were murdered, and then the procession of the Amish buggies, and then during the time of the funeral. One of the things that came from this, from a newspaper report, it said the transforming power of forgiveness may be one of the redeeming things that flowed from the blood that was shed in Nickel Mine this week. And that was, weekly account. I think with reconciliation, we can see, some transforming power of forgiveness, that it doesn't have the same hold over us. It's not always easy, but again, reconciliation, as we know, really is the work of God, and allowing God to help us in our efforts at reconciliation. Thank you for joining me again for another Father Tim Talk, and we'll see you at the next time.